everyone, let's do some of these problems. So this first problem is called diagonal sum. It takes a 2D int array as input and it returns an integer output. Reading the problem, it says that if the input array is a square array, then the diagonal sum will return twice the sum of all the diagonal elements. Note, don't double count the center element. So let's see, in this example it looks like here's one diagonal, here's another, so if I just added up all these numbers and those numbers, I would be double counting this number 5. Notice also though that that's not true for every single possible array. If my array was 4 by 4, then the two diagonals wouldn't overlap in a central element. So noticing things like that about the problem is a key to doing these problems well. So think about a range of possible examples and think about how the problem is going to be different depending on those examples. It says if the array is not square, then it should return 0. Okay, so here I am. I've got my diagonal sum method. I've went ahead and written some helper methods. So I've got a getRandomArray method, which takes a width and a height and a maximum value, and it will generate an array, a new array full of random numbers. And then I also made a display, which will display a 2D array. And we can use that for testing later. Okay, so diagonal sum. I guess the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check to make sure array is not null. So if array equals null, I'm going to return 0. Next thing I'll do is I'll check to make sure that it's square. So if array.length, which is the height of the array, is not equal to array element 0, which is the top row dot length. So the length of the top row is like the number of columns. So if the number of rows is not the same as the number of columns, it's not square, and then I'll return 0. I think that the strategy I'm going to use is I'm going to add up all these numbers, add up all those numbers, and then if the size of the array is odd, then I'll subtract the middle element because I will have double added it. The important thing to note about this problem is we're not going to use that nested for loop pattern where like for every row I'm going to loop through every column, because that's a way of visiting all the elements. But I don't want to visit all the elements, I just want to loop down the diagonal. So I want to go from like 0, 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3, and so on. So really I just want to loop I from 0 to whatever the length of the array is. And then I'll be accessing elements along the diagonal, so the row and the column will be the same. So this would be like 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, and so on. I will need a sum variable, which I'll initialize to 0. So I'll say sum equals itself plus each of these diagonal elements. If I wanted to, I could make a whole second loop afterwards to loop the other direction, but there's sort of no sense in that. If I can figure out how to get the other diagonal with this same line, I could just do both diagonals at the same time. Oops, what's happening? So let's do that. Here, this II is going to cover this direction, but I also want to go that direction. So I want to think about sort of what numbers are those going to be. So let's imagine starting up here and going that way. So row is going 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Meanwhile, the columns start with the highest column index, which is, let's see, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it'll be 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. So it's like as my rows are counting up, my columns are counting down. So let's do that. Here my rows, I want those to count up from 0 to the end of the array, so I is appropriate. My columns, I want them to count down, so I'm going to start with my maximum valid column, which is array 0.length minus 1, and then I want to subtract I. And you can just double check that this makes sense. Think the first time through the loop, I is 0. This, in my example, is going to be, let's see, array.length is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So array.length minus 1 is 4, which should give us this last column index. So then 4 minus 0 is 4. But then as I goes up by 1 every time, this is going to subtract down by 1 every time from 4. So this is going to give us sort of the right pattern that we want. Being able to think clearly about what indices do you want to visit and what's a way of calculating the right index, this is sort of a tricky skill, but it's one that you can definitely get better at with practice. All right, so I'm almost done, but I said that I needed to check if the size of the array was odd. So I'm going to say if array.length mod 2 equals 1, because that's how I check for odd length. So if the remainder when I divide it by 2 is equal to 1, then I'm going to get the central element and I'm going to subtract it. So sum equals sum minus array. Well, let's think, how do I get the central element? So it's probably going to be array.length over 2. And then I'll return the sum. So I think that's going to work. Let's go ahead and test it. So I'm going to make a test array, get random array. It's going to be a 4x4 array with a maximum value of 5, let's say. And now I'll say diagonal sum test array. And now I want to display my test array and also print out the sum. So here we go. Oops, doesn't like that. What's going on? Oh, I have a, oh, what? Oh, I don't know how that X got in there. That's weird. Okay. So here we go. So here, the 4x4, let's add them up. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and it's displayed 16. So it looks like it successfully added up those two diagonals. Let's make it a 3x3 array and see if it successfully subtracts that middle element. So this is 2, well, here the middle element is 0, so that's not very helpful. Let's try this again. Okay, so here I've got 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 0. But then I'd subtract 2 because I counted this middle one twice, so that gives me 8. Okay, so that's great. So the last thing you want to do is read the problem again to make sure you covered all the elements. So if the array is square, diagonal sum returns, aha, twice the sum of the diagonal elements. So I did forget something. So I will return 2 times the sum. Don't double count the center element. If it's not square, it returns 0. Okay, cool. So I think we covered all the parts. Okay, this problem says, in part B of this problem, you will complete a method which will display the row and column of the upper left corner of the 5x5 region with the greatest number of 1s in it. So I'm imagining we've got kind of like a 5x5 box, and it's looping over all the possible locations. And every time we move the box, we're counting all the 1s, and we're remembering what was the location of when we counted the largest number of 1s. So it says for part A, we're going to write a helper method called getNumberOfOnesAt. And we're going to give it an array and a starting row and starting column, and it's going to return the number of 1s in the 5x5 grid with that as the upper left-hand corner. Okay, so this is very similar to stuff you've done in the homeworks before. So let's hammer this guy out. So public static int, what's it called? GetNum1sAt. And it takes an int array, and it takes a starting row and a starting column. All right, so I'm going to do bounds checking everywhere because I want to be extra safe. So I'm going to say if starting row is less than 0 or starting column is less than 0, I'm going to return 0. If starting row, so let's see, if I'm going to be looping, it's at a 5x5 box. So if I'm starting at starting row and it's a 5x5 box, I'm really only ever going to be adding 4 more to the index. Because like, let's think about it. If starting column is here, that's 0, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. But that's the 5th number out. So that's as far out as I would go. So it's like my starting row plus 4, which is the last index I'll ever get to, has to be less than array.length. Otherwise, it's bad. So actually, I'm going to test if it's greater than or equal to array.length, because then I know I'm out of bounds. and then starting column plus 4 is greater than or equal to array 0.length, I'll also return 0. So notice I'm not checking if starting row is bigger than array.length, because starting row is not the largest index I'm ever going to visit, because I'm going to be looping starting here, but I'm going to increase the row up to starting row plus 4. Something else you might be thinking is, just because you go out of bounds, let's say we're at like the very edge of the array, like right here, just because you're going to go out of bounds at the edge doesn't mean you can't count what's there. So like maybe if we're starting the box right here at this number 1, it should return 1. But I'm going to return 0 unless there is a full 5 by 5 box, because that was kind of what the problem was specifying. Okay, so I've done some bounds checking. Let's go ahead and loop. So I'm going to loop my row starting at my starting row, and I'm going to loop as long as row is less than starting row plus 4. Less than starting row plus 5. Less than or equal to starting row plus 4. And now row plus plus, and column is starting column, column is less than starting column plus 5, column plus plus. What was I doing? I'm counting the number of ones. So I'm going to make count start at 0, and I'm going to say if my array at row column equals 1, then I'm going to add to the count. And then at the end, I'll return the count. Okay. So I'm not going to test that one independently. Let's just assume that one works and proceed straight on to part B. So part B says display the most dense region location as described. So it looks like I'm just going to display it. Display it? Oh, I see. I'm not like displaying in the grid. I'm just displaying the location. So that means I don't have to return anything, which is convenient because a location is two things. It's a row and a column. All right, so let's do that. Public static void display most dense location. What's it called? Region location. And then I'm going to give it an array. All right, well now that I've done all of my bounds checking inside my helper method, so if I wanted to, I could just do something like this. I'm going to initialize my max density so far. So my max density so far, I'm going to initialize to 0, and that's safe because I can't have a density that's smaller than 0. So even in the worst case and the whole array is empty, this is still going to be accurate. So now I'm just going to loop over the whole dang array. R is less than array.length, R++. Oops. C is 0, C is less than array 0.length, C++. And now I'm going to get the density using my helper method, get num1s at, and I'm going to pass it the array and my row and my column. And now I'm going to say if density is greater than max density. Why is it auto-completing like that? Density so far. All right, so if density is greater than max density so far, then I'll, I guess I got to save a couple of things. I got to save the new max density. So that's the one I just calculated. But remember, at the end, I don't want to display what the density was. I want to display where I found the maximum density. So I'm going to store a temper, like a answer row and answer column. Or I'm going to initialize those both to 0. So now I can store answer row equals row and answer call equals C. And then at the end, I'll go ahead and print out max density at, and then I'll print the answer row and then the answer column. Okay, so I think that's going to work. And notice the only reason it's okay to do this is because I'm doing bounds checking inside here. Otherwise, I would want to do something like this. Let's see, row plus 4 has to be less than this. A different way of thinking about it is row has to be less than array.length minus 4. I think it makes more conceptual sense to do it this way, though, because row plus 4 is the largest row that this helper method is ever going to access. And so I want to make sure that that largest row is less than the array.length. So now I have bounds checking happening in 2 places. Okay, let's go ahead and test it. So I'm going to make a 10 by 10 array where the maximum possible value is 1. And I'm going to display the array first, and then I'm going to run display most dense region location, and I'm going to give it the test array. All right. Oh, I found a couple of things going wrong. So first of all, something's going wrong in here. What is it? Oh, I typed public again somehow. There was a bug in my getRandom array. Max val plus 1. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, great. So it's saying maximum density starts at 4, 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's saying this right here is the maximum density. It definitely looks like a high density. I'm a little surprised it's not happening here. No, that looks like it's got more ones in it. Let's do another one. 3, 2. So this is row 3, column 2. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2. So starting there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right, because I get all of these ones in there. Although, again, I'm a little bit surprised. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, because if I'm going to have a 5 by 5 box and get all the way to the bottom, I have to start in this row, which includes all these zeros. So that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, cool. So that's that one. All right, last problem. This one's called 2D Array Transpose. So the transpose of an array is an array where the values in the rows and columns have been swapped, as shown here. So it looks like all the rows have now become columns. You can kind of see that in the color coding. An array doesn't need to be square to be transposed. If you transpose an array that has 3 rows and 5 columns, the resulting array will have 5 rows and 3 columns, right? Because I guess the sizes are also going to transpose. So complete a method called transpose that takes a 2D string array as input and returns a 2D string array that's the transpose of the input array. Great. Let's do it. So here, public static, it said it's going to return a 2D string array, so that's the return value. It's going to be called transpose. It takes a 2D string array as input, which I'll call R. So the first step is I want to make my output array. So I'll say string array, I'll call it out. And then it's going to be the same size as the input array, only the number of rows and columns is going to be reversed. So ordinarily this would be the number of rows, but I want to give it the same number of rows as the input array's columns. And the column length for the output array should be the same as the number of rows for the input array. All right, so let's loop over one of them. So I'll say row is 0, row is less than array.length, row plus plus, column equals 0, column is less than array 0.length, column plus plus. So I'm going to do this like step by step. You can do it in all in one line if you want to, but I'm going to get the value out of the input array first. So row column. And I'm sure that this is not, oh, it's not a string. Sorry, it's not an int, it's a string. Okay, so I'm sure this isn't going to go out of bounds because the row and the column that I'm using, I'm only looping up to the end of the input array. So that works. But now I want to assign that value to my output array where a column and a row are reversed, like this. And I should feel confident that this isn't going to go out of bounds because here column is going to go up to my input array's column length, but I'm using it here as the row number for my output array. But my output array has exactly that many rows. It's got the same number of rows as the columns for the input. So I think all that should work. Let's go ahead and return my output at the end. Oh, I don't have a totally good way to test this because I didn't make something that would generate random character arrays. Heck, let's do it. All right, so for testing purposes, let's do this. Random string array, and it's going to have a width and a height, and I'm going to have it take an alphabet string that it will randomly sample letters from. So let's make our output array. Let's see, rows, that's the same thing as height. Columns is the same thing as width. So there we go. Now let's loop over all the things. And now I'm going to generate a random letter, which I'm going to get by saying alphabet.substring, and it's going to be a substring from, I guess I'm going to get a random index first. So I'm going to get a random index into my alphabet string. Now I'm going to get the substring from index to index plus 1, so that's just going to give me one letter. And now my output array at row column is going to equal that letter, and then at the end I can return out. Okay, so now I'm set up for testing. Oh, I'm almost set up for testing. I'm just going to replace this display method to display strings instead. All right, so instead of getRandomArray, I'm going to call it RandomStringArray. So I'm going to make it like a 2x5 array because that should be really obvious. And it returns a string array. And then I'm just going to display the output. So let's see. Oh, sorry. I got to actually get the output. So I'm going to transpose test. So first I'm going to display test, then I'm going to display the output. And in between, I'm going to display some stars. Okay, here we go. Come on. What's happening? Transpose. Okay. So here I've got DEBBCE, and then I've got DEBBCE. Great, so it looks like it's transposed it just fine. That is all.